Day on November 5th. I know for some of you it is a holiday, including our speaker, so thank you for joining us today. That is why Sheila is not here as the host. She is volunteering today in the US for Election Day, but you'll be joined by me and my other co-host, Elias, for this Conservation Impact Evaluation Implementation Science Seminar. So with that, I'll let the last few people in and we'll get started. If this is your first seminar with us, thank you and welcome. And if not, you know our goal as the Impact Evaluation Working Group Board. We aim to advance evidence-based biodiversity conservation efforts across the globe by supporting the adoption of counterfactual approaches to understanding the impacts of conservation actions and interventions. There's a lot of ways to get involved with our working group. You can find more on our working group webpage through the Society for Conservation Biology. You can follow us on social media, and we do have an email list where we keep you up to date on the activities that our board is taking on. As a recap from the last seminar that we had in October, that seminar with Daniela on community sawmills is now available via recording, either through Vimeo or on the Society for Conservation Biology's webpage. Today, we're joined by Rachel Neugarten, and she will take over in just a minute on the PhD to practitioner pipeline that she is going to share with us today. And then upcoming to end the year, we're going to have a panel discussion, a sneak peek of the Bridging the Impact Evaluation Research Practice Gap in Conservation from the special issue that we promoted earlier this year. So we hope you'll join us again in December. And as a quick housekeeping reminder, we do not have a seminar in January. We will resume on the 4th of February, 2025. Some more housekeeping. You can post all of your questions in the chat. We do not allow you to come off mute, but you can post in the chat at any time. And this seminar is being recorded and will be available shortly after the presentation today. And with that, I will introduce our speaker, Rachel Neugarten, on her presentation on PhD to Practitioner, Practical Approaches to Impact Evaluation, Lessons from Madagascar and Beyond. All right, Rachel, over to you.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Nice to have two Rachels on the same webinar. All right, let me share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Great. All right. So welcome, everyone. Lovely to be here. Thanks to those of you who are joining. I hope those of you who can vote in the States have already gone out and done so. If not, I won't be offended at all if you go off and vote during this hour. The session will be recorded and you're welcome to watch it later. So as Rachel said, I'm joining you today to talk about my experience with impact evaluation, both as a practitioner and within academia. Currently, my title is Executive Director of Conservation Planning with the Wildlife Conservation Society. But prior to this, I was doing my PhD at Cornell University. So I'm going to describe some work I did there as part of my PhD, and even prior to that with Conservation International. So this talk has three parts, excuse me. I'll introduce myself and sort of why I got interested in impact evaluation. I'll talk a little bit about my research which focused in Madagascar. And then I'll talk more generally about sort of what I have learned from this journey between sort of my academic and NGO career. And then in part three, as promised, I'll try to provide some suggestions in terms of where we go from here and some sort of practical approaches. And I also have some very specific appeals to all of you, calls to action that I'm hoping you can help me with. So just by way of introduction, I'll talk a little bit about my current role and my history, just so you get a sense of who I am and why these questions are so important in my career. So currently, as I mentioned, I'm with the Wildlife Conservation Society. For those of you who are not familiar, we're a major conservation organization. We work on the ground in more than 50 countries. Our work includes sites, including more than 600 protected areas. We're headquartered in New York City. I'm based in Ithaca, New York, near Cornell University. And within WCS, I lead our conservation planning team. And by planning, we mean both spatial planning and strategic planning. And there's, of course, a link between planning and evaluation. But we also have teams that focus on rights and communities, health, the links between biodiversity, health, including both wildlife health and human health. We have international policy teams. We have a markets team. So I'm part of our sort of central science support that supports our country staff who are doing the really hard work of conservation on the ground. Prior to coming to WCS, I've had a fairly varied career. I started with the Nature Conservancy in 2004. I did a master's with Cornell University, joined Conservation International for 8 years, went back to Cornell for my PhD. I have affiliations with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I've also been members of various partnerships. So the Conservation Measures Partnership, really over the last almost 20 years, I've been involved with them. They were very much set up to answer some of these questions about the effectiveness of conservation. They're a multi-NGO partnership, and I'm also a member of the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership. So rather than throwing a bunch of logos at you, I just wanted to explain that sort of my path has been sort of in and out from the NGO world back to the academic world. So really my title probably should have been Practitioner to PhD to Practitioner, but that was getting a little bit long. And so I've sort of been, again, dipping my toes in this question from both an NGO perspective and an academic perspective. I just got back from spending 2 weeks in Colombia at the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of Parties. Some of you I know were also there. While we were there, this headline came out. I don't know if any of you saw this in The Guardian. A very alarming headline saying that biodiversity is declining even faster in protected areas than the global average. So I, of course, had to delve into this question because the headline seemed counterintuitive based on what I've read in the published literature. And it turns out that the authors compared something called the Biodiversity Intactness Index inside and outside protected areas. And they found that, quote, while ecosystem integrity is overall much higher in protected areas than outside by 12 percentage points on average, the rate of decline in protected areas was higher than the global average. So I delved into the report. It's a policy briefing put out by the Museum of Natural History in London. It's not a peer-reviewed paper. They don't actually provide their methods, but my guess is that they did not control for the fact that areas outside of protected areas are already much more degraded and therefore have less biodiversity to lose in the first place. I'm not sure of that. Again, I can't validate that. I'll reach out to the authors to find out. But if I'm right, this headline is misleading at best and honestly really counterproductive. I mean, there's many published studies that do find that protected areas, when well-resourced, well-managed, and put in the right places, do effectively conserve biodiversity. So this is exactly the kind of problem, as you all are all very familiar with, that impact evaluation is trying to avoid. So with that, let's take a trip across the world to Madagascar. In 2019, I started a PhD. I had been at Conservation International for about 8 years prior to that, and I had the wonderful opportunity to take several trips to Madagascar, really more related to my spatial planning work, to work and support our teams there. I got introduced to a colleague, Renaivu Rasulufuson, based at Cornell. He was a postdoc, and he is an impact evaluation expert. He's worked with Paul Ferraro and Julia Jones and others. And he had an impact evaluation research project that was all queued up, and very kindly allowed me to work on this project to learn the methodology. As you're probably well aware, Madagascar is a biodiversity hotspot. It has very high rates of species endemism, so species that are found nowhere else on the earth, extremely high numbers of very critically endangered species. It also, of course, has very high rates of poverty and food insecurity. The people in Madagascar are very heavily dependent on natural resources for food, for water, for cooking, and for their livelihoods. So this is a place where the stakes of conservation are very high, both for the biodiversity and the people. Madagascar also has historically very high rates of deforestation. By some estimates, the country lost almost half of its natural forest cover just since the 1950s. The map on the left shows deforestation from 2000 until 2020. So we're the more recent era when we have slightly more reliable data. The remaining forest cover is shown in green, and the red to yellow colors are deforestation during that 20-year period. Drivers of deforestation are primarily clearing forest for rice agriculture, charcoal production, and again, this is often subsistence needs, but also some level of clearing for timber. So in an effort to protect its remaining forests, the government of Madagascar and international NGOs have established a system of conservation areas. These include protected areas administered by various entities. One of the entities is called Madagascar National Parks. It's a quasi-statal entity, parastatal entity. Those are shown in blue on this map. These are parks that were established as of 2005. So there's some protected areas that have been established more recently, but for various reasons, we were looking at 2005 as our baseline year, which I'll explain later. Starting in the 1990s, Madagascar also started establishing a system of community forest management areas. These are shown in purple on the map. The objectives of the community forest management areas are to protect forests, but also provide benefits to local communities, whereas the MNP protected area system are managed primarily for biodiversity conservation and some level of recreation and tourism. Previous research has shown that protected areas are effective at reducing deforestation, but the effectiveness varies across time and space. So Johanna Eklund, who's one of the co-organizers of these webinars, published research demonstrating the effectiveness of protected areas. There's also been a study by my colleague Renaivu on the effectiveness of community forests. They were shown overall to have no detectable effect on deforestation, although certain CFM, which prohibited commercial uses, were effective. So I'm building on this previous work. During the 2009 to 2014 political crisis, so that the country experienced a very severe and prolonged political crisis for 5 years, there were reports of illegal logging within the national parks, and this really alarmed the conservation community. So there were sort of, headlines like this one about, huge concerns about deforestation. There was illegal logging for rosewood in particular, a precious hardwood, and there was concerns about the impact of this on the country's biodiversity, of course. So our question in this study, again, building on previous research, is really about this political crisis. Given that biodiversity is concentrated in politically fragile nations, and in many countries, crisis really is normal. So we tend to think of conservation and the effectiveness of conservation in terms of its performance during stability. But in many countries in the world, whether it's a pandemic or a political crisis or an economic crisis or a natural disaster, crisis really, repeated crises really actually are sort of the operating environment in which conservation has to perform. So as my colleague Chris Barrett put it, how can we shock-proof conservation, given that a lot of biodiversity is concentrated in places where crises are quite common? The fundamental challenge in this research, as in most impact evaluation studies, is that just comparing deforestation in protected areas and community forests. So our question was the relative performance of these two different mechanisms, these more parastatal or government protected areas like national parks and the community managed forests. Our hypothesis was that they might have performed differently. So given a crisis, given that the government, the funding stopped flowing, the government's capacity to monitor and enforce might have declined, we assumed that there would be a difference in performance. We weren't sure which direction that would be, but we had a hunch that maybe the community forests actually might have performed better. So how do we answer that question? We can't just straight up compare outcomes, because community forests, as you remember from the map, they tend to be smaller, they tend to be located on sort of the buffers around traditional protected, government protected areas, and they tend to be in very different settings. So these two photos show Ranamafana National Park on the left and Anjozoro Bay Community Forest, or the landscape around a community forest on the right, right? So there's roads, there's agriculture, there's people living there typically. So these areas are facing very different levels of background pressures. This is the fundamental challenge with any impact evaluation study. So it's an apples and oranges, right, comparison. You can't simply compare deforestation in these two kinds of sites and hope to get an answer. So we used two methods to address this challenge. I'm not going to go into detail on the methods here for lack of time, but the paper is published in Nature Communications. I'm happy to share it. I'm also happy to talk to people one-on-one about the details. But basically, we used a combination of statistical matching and an event study analysis, which is a kind of difference in differences analysis, except it's got more points in time. And the goal of this, of course, was to go from an apples and oranges comparison to an apples to apples comparison. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but for those of you who are familiar with sort of interpreting coefficients, basically what we're trying to show here is the difference in performance, or sorry, the difference in effect of the crisis on these two types of areas. So generally, points above 0 are showing that the crisis had a positive effect on deforestation. That's a bad outcome from the perspective of conservation. The red line is the effect of the crisis on the community forests, and the blue line is the effect of the crisis on matched forests within protected areas, so equivalent sites done after the statistical matching. So the takeaway here was that during the crisis years, there was elevated deforestation in both kinds of areas, and there was not a statistically significant difference between them. So the crisis had basically a negative effect. It increased deforestation in both kinds of sites. Interestingly to us, and not at all what we expected, after the crisis ended, so from 2014 to 2017, there was an increase in deforestation overall, and the community forests performed much worse. So there was a statistically significant difference. There was sort of an increase in deforestation in both kinds of sites, but it was worse in the community forest for several years. And then while it remained high, there was no longer a statistically significant difference between the two kinds of sites. So generally a discouraging story. And this post-crisis era, contrary to our expectations, seemed to be when things got actually very difficult. So just to put that again, kind of in plain language, the crisis and the post-crisis dynamics did negatively impact conservation performance, and the community managed forests seem to have been particularly vulnerable. We don't know exactly why, and we don't know exactly what happened in that post-crisis era. I've talked to anyone and everyone I can think to in terms of experts and people who have worked on the ground during that post-crisis era. And we actually haven't found an explanation for that, so there's definitely need for further research. But one of my takeaways from this is that the community managed forests, if they are going to be successful in terms of their conservation objectives, probably need external support. There's a need for greater either funding, capacity, monitoring, and enforcement, because when things got difficult everywhere, the community forests were really unable to withstand the pressure. So with that, I'm going to transition. I'm sorry that was very brief, but again, there's a lot more detail in the paper, and I'd be happy to follow up with anyone. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of what I've learned more generally from my foray into impact evaluation. So while I was doing my PhD, it was during the pandemic, so I had a lot of time to read papers. This is me with my dog on the couch reading impact evaluation papers. I really wanted, I was aware of this literature. I had read some of the studies, but I really wanted to try to read as many studies as I could and really understand sort of what we know and what we don't know in terms of the effectiveness of conservation using these sort of more rigorous approaches. So I focused on papers that used experimental or quasi-experimental methods or controlled for confounding factors. So there's some very good qualitative impact evaluation studies out there. So far, I've reviewed about 140 papers, maybe a few more. And I've been building this database. So I want to offer this to you as the community. I've been collecting papers. I've been coding them by what country they're covering. Some of them are multiple countries or global. what methods they used. More frequently, I had quasi-experimental methods. There was a very small handful of experimental papers, what intervention types they were studying, what impact types they were studying, whether it was environmental impacts or socioeconomic impacts or both, and then the direction of the effect, whether they found a positive effect, no statistically significant effect, a negative effect, or a mixed effect. So a mixed effect study would be they studied two different types or categories of protected areas, or they studied protected areas over time and they found different effects. So if anybody wants a copy of this database, it's just a big Excel or CSV file. I'm happy to share it. It's not complete. This was not a systematic review. This was papers that I started with Web of Science and then I just added to over time. So I'm sure there's a lot of papers missing here, including a lot of papers that have come out just in the last few years, because I originally did this in 2021. So I would love for this to become a resource for this community, so that somebody like me 3 or 5 years from now, can find something like this already done and find papers that are relevant to the place that they're working or the question that they're trying to answer. In general, more positive impacts were reported. So the blue bar is the number of impacts in these studies that I reviewed. Again, this is not a systematic or a comprehensive review, so don't pay much attention to the numbers, because if you added 5 or 10 or 100 papers, the numbers might vary, but I'm guessing the proportions would be about the same. So generally, positive effects were found both on socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. However, there are some studies, of course, that show negative effects, particularly on people. And there are, as we all know, a number of studies that find no significant effect when it comes to environmental outcomes. So these are the kinds of projects that worry me, right? So these are projects that may be wasting resources, may actually be harming people. And this is really kind of the moral underpinning for all of this work. We really need to understand, if our funding is being spent in the most impactful way, and we need to understand this issue of how conservation is affecting people, particularly local people and particularly very vulnerable people, such as those in Madagascar. The most useful kinds of studies for people like me are these systematic reviews. So this paper was published by Jan Borner et al. In 2020, and they actually looked across numerous published studies and compared effect sizes by intervention type on deforestation. So I'm not sharing this graph to really get into sort of the results that they shared, but just to say this kind of a paper is super useful for someone like me who's really trying to wrap their head around what do we know, what don't we know, which kinds of interventions can we, say work in what kinds of contexts and so forth. So what have we learned based on my review of the papers? It seems that there's fairly good evidence that protected areas and payments for ecosystem services programs, when put in the right locations, can reduce deforestation, which is an interesting point for me, since most of my work has focused on spatial prioritization. The where question turns out to be very important for the effectiveness as well. Unfortunately, there's really too few studies on other intervention types and impact types to generalize. There are a whole host of wonderful papers on other kinds of interventions and other kinds of outcome types beyond deforestation, but very difficult to do any kind of systematic review. I think the reason that Jan Borner and others focused on deforestation as the outcome is it was possible. There were enough papers that they could actually look across papers and generalize. This is consistent with recent findings. Some of you may have seen this paper that was published by Penny Langhammer et al. On the positive impact of conservation action. So they looked across as many studies as they could that used counterfactual based approaches and tried to really estimate, does conservation work or not? So this is the kind of question that I was also grappling with, and in what contexts. So they found, as you may be aware, that in 2/3 of trials, conservation either improved the state of biodiversity or at least slowed declines, right? So that's what led to the headline that, conservation generally has positive effects. However, not really included in the headlines or sort of the media coverage in this paper is that means that in 1/3 of cases, conservation wasn't working, right? And again, these are the cases that you and I and this group is really worried about. In 1/5 of trials, biodiversity under the intervention declined more than no action. I mean, I think that's a pretty stark finding. In a smaller number of cases, about a little more than 10, 1 in 10, biodiversity improved in both the intervention and the counterfactual, but the counterfactual revealed greater improvements. And then there was no difference in about 2% of trials. So very interesting finding. Also, I think very interesting sort of media uptake of this, painted a very rosy picture. But I think 1/3 is a lot. I also have some concerns that the available evidence base, in addition to being limited, right, a limited number of interventions for which we can generalize and a limited number of impact types, I'm concerned that there may be a bias in the published research. So many of us have probably been part of papers that never actually got written. This is me doing forest ecology in New Hampshire many years ago in a study that never got written up. We've also probably been part of papers or reports that were never submitted to journals. This is called the file drawer problem. There may be disincentives, especially if you work within an NGO and you find a finding of no significant effect or a negative effect. There may be a disincentive to publish that research and make it public. And even if it is submitted, there's publication bias. So journals are less likely to publish insignificant findings, or I would argue negative results. So I have a hunch that there's a positive bias in the kinds of studies that are getting published. So where do we go from here? So I was painting a fairly negative picture, but I really don't want the takeaway to be, well, conservation doesn't work, just give up and go home. I think we really want to avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So our colleague Julia Jones published this paper pointing out that there's been a lot of negative media attention on the voluntary carbon market, including some headlines that sort of called carbon offset projects useless and the investments being wasted. But we really don't want the takeaway to be not to invest in tropical forest conservation. This is still so utterly important for so many reasons. So my takeaway from all of this is actually that we need more funding for conservation, not less. So there's this huge gap in the available funding. There was a report from 2020 that indicates that it would cost something like $700 billion a year to actually achieve all of the Convention on Biological Diversity conservation targets, basically to stop and reverse declines in biodiversity. So I suspect, based on my own work and our research in Madagascar, that the vast majority of conservation projects, especially in these fragile developing nations, are vastly under-resourced. So how can we really expect local communities in Madagascar to defend their forests without external support and without addressing their basic needs? I do think that there may be, in certain cases, a case for changing strategy and even divesting in certain sites if the conservation project really isn't working, and especially if there may be negative impacts on local people. But I suspect that that's often because the project is under-resourced. There's a huge incentive within the conservation world to make very lofty commitments and lofty promises to donors, transformative change. With your $1 million, we will stop deforestation in the Amazon. And so I think there's a disincentive for more incremental, statistically significant, but positive outcomes. And I think that donors tend to give money to projects that make these, very lofty claims, but therefore there's sort of a gap in the actual financing needed to achieve those very lofty outcomes. And we're working in contexts that are hard, right? These are wicked problems. You're working in contexts with poverty and crises and political complexities. As I mentioned, I just spent the last 2 weeks in Colombia, where discouragingly, governments really failed to come to a final agreement before running out of time. So again, I think the takeaway here is really that the world is not prioritizing biodiversity conservation. we need to really think about, collectively as a society, how we're going to finance this, how we're going to get resources from the relatively wealthy world to the less wealthy part of the world where the vast majority of biodiversity is concentrated. And very sadly, there really wasn't a lot of progress made at the most recent convention. So I'm assuming most of you don't have 700 billion lying around, but you can still help. I have lots of ideas. Here's some very practical things that I think we all could do. So I mentioned this database of papers. I would love it if you'd use it, share it with your colleagues, add your papers to it. I would love to explore the use of artificial intelligence to add to the database in an automated way. Some of you saw a query from me that went around the listserv. I think the tool we originally hoped to use wasn't really quite ready for prime time, but I am hoping that over time, the database, rather than me reading hundreds of papers, could be populated automatically. So if anyone is interested in working on that problem, I would love it. I would love to set up a matchmaking service between researchers and practitioners. I mean, there's an army of you who are now trained in these methods and could support practitioners who really often don't have the resources and the specialized skills or the incentive to do this kind of research. So we really need your help. You all have tremendous knowledge and materials to share. So I'd love to set up an online repository with some introductory slides. I still have to have this conversation about what is impact evaluation? Why is it needed? Why is it important? How is it different from traditional monitoring approaches that donors already require? So I'm really still struggling to sort of convey some of these basic concepts, how it's different and why it's important. And then I have a very specific R coding request for those of you who are R coders that I'll show in a minute. And of course, when it comes to the $700 billion question, the only thing we can all really do is vote. So the US is the only country other than the Vatican who has not signed on to the Convention on Biological Diversity. I very much hope in my lifetime that that changes. So people like me need very simple illustrative graphics to help build understanding of these concepts and again, how it's different from traditional monitoring. Those of you who are teachers or TAs may have resources that you could share, just slides that sort of illustrate these issues. So this is one that I put together very quickly, not beautiful, on just the difference between impact evaluation versus sort of monitoring, traditional monitoring of trends, right? So if you are just monitoring, you may think that the trend is improving or stable or declining, but without a counterfactual, you don't actually know what the effect of the intervention has been. And it actually may be in the opposite direction to what the monitoring is telling you, right? So something just simple like this that we could share with our colleagues would be really beneficial. In terms of practical approaches to impact evaluation, my colleague Nick Solafsky loves to talk about the gold standard versus the aluminum standard. So he shows this graph of the probability of making the correct decision on the y-axis and how it changes with increasing investment in evidence. So since the relationship is not linear, there's different optimization points for different situations. So he talks about if there's a high standard of proof, right? If you're working in a context where basically the risk of failure is very high. You're dealing with a critically endangered species or people who are extremely vulnerable. You may have a higher standard of proof. It may be worth maximizing the evidence. And the gold standard of impact evaluation would probably be appropriate. But in many cases, it's probably better to maximize your return on investment using what he calls the aluminum standard, something that's cheap, that's flexible, that can be applied in all conservation projects, right? So all projects should have at least a minimum of monitoring and evaluation, at least to understand, are they doing the things that they committed to doing, and are the outcomes what they'd hoped for? That doesn't get at the impact question, but it's better than many projects are doing now, which is very little or no monitoring. So I would argue that there's some very practical things that we all can do. So partnerships, again, between researchers and practitioners is absolutely necessary. I mean, I had to quit my job and go get a PhD to learn impact evaluation using quasi-experimental methods. That's very impractical for the vast majority of people, even scientists working with major conservation NGOs. Developing a strong theory of change with a counterfactual. So many programs do think about theories of change, not all. So we would like to, ensure that programs are really making explicit their causal assumptions about how what they're doing is going to lead to intermediate and long-term outcomes. We would like those theories of change to be based on evidence and more robust, but we would also like to add to that a counterfactual. So what would happen in the absence of your intervention? And can you actually monitor some things that would indicate what would have happened in the absence of your program? There's also some very simple experimental things we can think about. Paul has some great suggestions about varying your treatment arms, maybe phasing in treatment and using your later intervention sites as controls for your earlier intervention sites. Conservation projects, we can never do everything everywhere all at once. So can we use some sort of built-in sort of experimental sort of light touch experimentation and data collection to try to get at least partway to the question of what's the actual added benefit of the conservation. There's lots of partnerships already out there. I mentioned the Conservation Measures Partnership. There's this group led by Bill Sutherland looking at conservation evidence and trying to build data platforms to capture evidence. And then of course there's our group. We're kind of the new kid on the block, but I would really love these groups to work together more. The first two I would say are a bit more sort of practitioner oriented. And they really would benefit, I think, from more cross-pollination and collaboration. So very specific shout out to those of you with our coding expertise. My colleague, Herman Ferrero Medina, who's with the Wildlife Conservation Society based in Colombia, he's an impact evaluation expert. He said, we have this problem where the government doesn't actually have a rigorous way of showing that deforestation in their protected area system is actually lower than areas outside, with controls for the fact that there's bias in the location. So he built a tool, an Our Shiny app, to actually do this for the government in an automated way. So it does statistical matching based on a set of covariates, and it would allow the Parks Agency in Colombia to actually demonstrate in a more rigorous way the effectiveness of the park system at reducing deforestation. The only challenge is that we can't get it working yet. So if any of you would like to help, this is the kind of tool that we really need in our space, right? We don't have the resources and the capacity to do a peer-reviewed publication, but we need practical tools like this that our partners who are actually doing the conservation work can take up and use and can maybe be updated every year. I also just want to give a shout out again. There are a lot of people who are working in this space and who are trying to collate the evidence for conservation. So I don't want to minimize all the existing effort. There's a lot of data platforms. And again, I think these data platforms where practitioners can go and kind of synthesize evidence and find evidence are going to be really key for people like me going forward. I also want to just mention how much hope I have from all of you. This is a photo of the impact evaluation session at ICCB last year. The room was overflowing by the end, standing room only. So I'm really heartened to see how many more students and researchers are getting trained in these methods and are keen to apply them. There's so many papers coming out, I can't keep up with them anymore. And this really does give me hope, knowing that we're all in this for the same goal. So with that, I'll leave you with words from the wise Paul Ferraro, who said, I'd like to see conservation change its guiding ethical precept from do something because we're in a crisis to do no harm. So with that, I'll thank you and take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. I will hand it over to Elias for our Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel, for this nice presentation. So there are a few questions that came up. One to your publication where you looked at the effect of crisis on community community forests, right, and versus protected areas. So, someone wanted to know more about your definition of crisis and your theory then across crisis, because some crisis could work in a beneficial way and others could work in a detrimental way for the conservation outcomes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I should have said that the results from one study in one country of one crisis should not be generalized. And that's a real challenge in impact evaluation research, right? So we have to be very focused and very sort of reductionistic in our approach to look at causal effects. But this bigger question of, yeah, what is a crisis and how it affects conservation performance is really the bigger picture question. So in that particular context, the crisis began, that particular crisis, Madagascar has had several, with the basically overthrow of the current president. The president was forced to flee the country, and the administration was taken over by the opposition. It was sort of internationally condemned as a non-democratic takeover, and so it was referred to by the external community as a crisis. I do recognize that that's a bit sensitive with the government in Madagascar. It was never formally referred to as a coup, for example. So, but in that context, it was because of the international lack of recognition for the administration, and there was a consequential huge drop in funding. So the government of Madagascar is quite dependent on foreign aid, and there was a complete stoppage of foreign aid for several years, which caused an economic crisis in addition to the political crisis. But I agree that that should not be considered indicative of all crises in all countries, right? And particularly that was not a particularly violent crisis. So there's countries that have gone through violent conflict periods, and the results can be, of course, quite different for conservation outcomes.
Yeah, great. So there was one question on you mentioned the right locations for conservation intervention. So I know you do like spatial planning. So what are the right?
Yeah, so somewhat simplistically, a lot of the published conservation impact evaluation research has found that when conservation interventions are targeted to places that have higher levels of background threat, there's sort of, what do they call it? There's one of the authors put it, there's sort of a monster to fight against, right? So if there is active deforestation occurring, for example, and you invest in conservation in that location, you're more likely to show, an avoided deforestation effect of the conservation intervention simply because there was something for that conservation to address. The challenge, and it gets a bit tricky, is that protected areas, for example, tend to be located, and there's sort of the high and far paper that got published by Joppa and Pfaff. Protected areas tend to get located in places that have lower rates of background pressure because they tend to be located further from cities, further from roads, and places that have lower agricultural suitability, and therefore have lower background rates of pressure, and therefore their effectiveness in terms of reducing deforestation appears to be less, right? Because there's kind of no ongoing threat of deforestation, for example. That said, those dynamics can change, right? So that places that have high threat today, or low threat today, may have high threat tomorrow. So I think it's a bit tricky, but simplistically, there's some sort of counterintuitive approach findings of some of these papers where multiple use protected areas or community forests that tend to get located in these sort of buffer areas around protected areas, actually, if you look at the avoided deforestation, what would have happened in the absence of that intervention, they actually appear to be more effective than the core protected area, but it's because they're fighting more pressures. So that's the sort of location finding. But I do think yeah, so there's a concern that if you systematically bias conservation to these more remote places, it's just going to be less effective. But I do think that there's a time period dynamic to that, because again, those places may face threats in the future.
There are two questions on your discussion of Langhammer, right? Maybe because you're not a co-author here, I just wanted to open your comment on that, right? So 2/3 of papers show that there is an effect, right? And for me, that seems also pretty good, actually, right? Not too bad, right? And maybe from the last third, we can actually try to start understanding why they fail, rather than just discarding it as something bad, right?
Absolutely, I agree with that, and I do apologize to the co-authors of that paper for picking on it. I think I was trying to more make the point that the communication around it was almost unequivocally positive, which differed from how I would have interpreted it. But again, my takeaway isn't that conservation doesn't work. I suspect, again, that in many cases it's because those programs were under-resourced, under capacity, and working in very, very challenging contexts. So I do agree that 2/3 showing a positive effect is wonderful.
Yes, so just now came a question that came also earlier, right? What is your take on when do we need impact evaluation? Yes.
Yeah,
And,
great question. And I had a slide on that, but was worried I was running out of time. So I am still, I would still love guidance on this. And I think this community could provide guidance on when impact evaluation is needed versus what I would consider monitoring and evaluation, which I would argue is always needed for all projects at all scales. So some guiding principles that I have been considering are projects where the stakes are very high for biodiversity or people or both. So conservation of a critically endangered species in the last site where the species is located, I would argue you may have a higher sort of burden of evidence in that case that the conservation is actually effective and having better than no better than the counterfactual outcome. Similarly, where the people are extremely vulnerable and the effects of conservation may be highly detrimental to local communities, I would argue impact evaluation from an ethical standpoint is necessary. So high stakes projects that are very large in scope or budget, I would argue, should invest in impact evaluation. Big budgets, large geographic scope, because I think inherently in both those cases, the stakes are always high. So it kind of goes back to the first one. I would argue that projects where there is a requirement of showing additionality, such as a carbon offset project, where the project is premised on the idea that the effect of the intervention is something more than zero, whether it's a biodiversity offset or credit type of mechanism or a carbon project, I would argue that there should be investment in more rigorous counterfactual based approaches in those cases. And I think there was one more: large scope, large scale, high stakes, and requirements for additionality. Maybe those were it. But I would love guidance from the community on this, because I don't think that message has been made very clear. I think the message is often just we need more impact evaluation.
Great. So a few people are quite intrigued by your Shiny app, yes, but some critical comment also from Paul says, yes, we could, so let me summarize it. Maybe it's like we could just code a generic matching algorithm, right, and do this, right? And but what is more important is to first understand like where and why these interventions have happened, right, in order to, I guess, mitigate the underlying unobserved factors that run into that and mitigate the bias that you can estimate. Just running on some matching variables could even increase the estimation bias in this case, right? And,
Yeah, fair enough. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think that would be a fantastic question to explore, maybe with the protected areas in Colombia, specifically as a case study to understand which are the sort of covariates that are relevant given the history of why those places were put where they were. And I would refer you all to my colleague Herman, who could answer those questions better than I can.
Maybe we can come back a little bit on your experience, how to like integrate more on the biodiversity evaluations, right? So some questions went to the direction of how do you actually now integrate biodiversity as an outcome in your evaluation methods, right? Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so we often use in our sector forest cover as a proxy for biodiversity, but I am very sensitive to the fact that it's not always an excellent proxy, that you can have standing tree canopy with, very small populations of animals left underneath, the sort of empty forest syndrome. And vice versa, you can have fairly effective conservation or restoration programs in places that don't necessarily have intact canopy. So there's lots of great papers in that database of people that have tried to measure biodiversity using different metrics, whether it's bird population trends. Julia Jones and I forget the Wauchope et al. Lead author looked at I think it was aquatic birds across lots and lots of sites in terms of how conservation was affecting bird populations. There's studies of fish biomass. There's studies of, various sort of more targeted effects on the biodiversity itself. Most of those studies really do rely on field collection of data, which is just much harder. The reason a lot of the studies, including my own, resort to forest cover is you can get data from before and after treatment and from your treatment and comparison sites because of the temporal and spatial comprehensiveness of the coverage. It's just very hard to get biodiversity data like that for other metrics of biodiversity, but absolutely it's essential. And there's lots of great data sets coming online. So my colleagues here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology have this great eBird data set, and we've been exploring the use of eBird. It has been used in a couple of papers. Victor Cazales et al. Have published a couple studies using eBird. I think there's potential there. And there's bioacoustic data coming online. So I do think there'll be ways of getting at this question better for other elements of biodiversity.
Yes, that seems great. If no other question is coming up in a second, maybe we can close. Oh, interesting. Yes, I think we can adjourn. Yes. Thank you very much, Rachel, for the great answers and the great presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for joining, everyone. Just a reminder, we do have our final seminar of 2024 on December 3rd. It will be a panel. So if you're interested in bridging the gap between research and practice, this is another great seminar to attend. It will be a sneak peek on our special issue in Conservation Science and Practice, Bridging the Impact Evaluation Research Practice Gap in Conservation. I've just dropped the names of the speakers who will be presenting previews of their papers that will be in that special issue. If you would like to join us, thank you again, Rachel, for this super interesting presentation. I think it really matches the breadth of audience we have here, from academics to practitioners and vice versa. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.